Good day, my name is Gwen Phillips and I'm from the Ktunaxa Nation, and I'm so pleased to be with you today in your gathering to speak about open data. It's been something that I've been following for quite a few years myself. I'm not a data expert. I do governance work with my own nation, the Ktunaxa Nation. And so open government, of course, has been an interest because open government, open data, accountability, transparency, very important facts. The Ktunaxa peoples, as a distinct population, have always been data collectors. In fact, my great-grandfather was one of the last war chiefs for the Akanahonik of the Ktunaxa peoples. And this is a journal page from his records. And you'll see encrypted data on this page. So knowing that we have always been data collectors, we've always made evidence-based decisions. And in fact, this is what you would consider encrypted data, because when you look at it, I'm sure you can't make a lot of sense out of it. But he would interpret this data, and that knowledge that contained in this data would be transferred onto the people that it needed to be transferred to. Now, prior to being written on a page of a journal like this, it was actually written on a hide. And so he had hide calendars, hide records to go back. He also used a buckskin ball, a string with knots and different colors put into it. Again, encrypted data. So the form that data takes is many, and we've got to know that. And so the expertise, again, in data collection, data use, it might look different to different peoples. The Ktunaxa peoples, again, recognizing that we are a nation, a comprehensive, cohesive nation of people made up of various parts. And so a nation is an identity, not an entity. Just like in Canada, it's a geography, it's a space. Canadian is the identity we have as people of Canada. And then inside of that, we create governments as entities. So the government of Canada is the entity that represents the citizens of Canada. And so it's the same for the Ktunaxa people or Indigenous populations. We have a language that holds us together as a nation group, but we have unique governments within that broader construct. And so for the Ktunaxa, we are many unique peoples held together by a common language. But each one of those communities is governed by a government selected by those people. So we are peoples that belong to a nation, and we have governments in the communities that we live in. And so political correctness has caused us to be all kinds of strange words over the years. And now community becomes the word that we settled on. But community is a space, and it's a group of people with common unity. And inside of that, there are entities that we create. And that has to be understood, because for the longest time, we were not considered to be governing bodies. And now the language of the legislation around us in Canada is catching up, but still finding ourselves in that legislation, finding ourselves, our identity as unique populations is very difficult. So the whole agenda up to date has been about assimilation, first annihilation, assimilation, genocide, however you want to slice it. That's what was happening in Canada and in global populations, of course. So, you know, this is an excerpt from some of that lovely era we went through, Duncan Campbell Scott's era. And the philosophy at that point in time, and for a good 40 or so years, if not continuing very subtly today, is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. No Indian question, no Indian department. We were looked at as problems since contact. Oh gosh, there's a problem here. There's people here already. Gosh, we got to get this land and the resources somehow. We got to deal with these people. And so initially started off with treaties and recognition of gentleman to gentleman agreements with the British Crown, but then everything kind of went sideways. And so for the longest time, we were, and have been and continue to be, into this forced oppression, looking at assimilating us, looking at getting rid of us, sticking us on reserves. Like the whole life that we've been living as Indigenous peoples, as First Nations peoples in particular, where I can speak of as a Ktunaxa person, has been a very challenging, a very difficult one. Recognition, reconciliation, those are just fancy words until you actually put some meaning to them, some make meaning of them. So when you understand that history, the history of a couple hundred years of this colonial pressure that's been pushed on us, our individual human beings, the organic human being is suffering a lot of trauma. And people recognize, you know, yeah, residential schools and trauma that potentially came from that era. But that's only a small part of the historical trauma we've experienced going back all the way from the beginning of colonization. And it's taken many forms. and continues today, as I say, because there's still efforts underway by the federal government to close the gap between who we are as Indigenous peoples and Canadians with respect to our socioeconomic status. And so if they're measuring us against Canadians as far as well-being goes, to me, it's a subtle attempt at looking again at assimilation. Are they as good as us? Are they doing as well as us? You know, well, maybe we don't want to be like you. Maybe we want to continue to be like who we are. And so understanding again for ourselves as Indigenous peoples, as populations, distinct populations, we have been traumatized to the point where it is affecting us organically, intergenerational organically, in places where our immune systems and other inflammatory disease has crept into our populations in numbers that are off the charts. And so we see the disease, but we don't understand the reason why. Go back to the root cause. Data is helping us to do this. Data is actually helping us to understand that a lot of the manifestations, that a lot of the disease and dysfunction we see is actually related to a lot of this other thing, or these other things that have happened to us historically. There's another thing that happened to us at a period of our history where a lot of our population was drinking, a lot of alcohol. And again, when you understand that our circumstances, being stuck on reserves where you were not even allowed to vote in Canada until 1960, Status Indians couldn't vote until 1960, even though there's law in place even now that tells us how we live on these reserves. So our environments, the characteristics, the behaviors, our circumstances, you know, all affected by the trauma of history, plus this brain change that occurred because of fetal alcohol exposure. So understanding that approximately 40% of my population, the Ktunaxa population, was exposed to fetal alcohol as fetuses, that potentially has changed the way their brains work. It can be a simple brain change that you just have memory issues, or all the way to, my gosh, that person is the one who's in jail. That person's the one whose children get taken away from them. That person is the one. So we've been labeled as all kinds of things that get over it, get on with it, without people really understanding what we're dealing with. And so data and open data and the way the federal government was behaving as far as we're going to open our data up to the world with respect to Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, it's like, no, you won't. You're the one who created these problems, and now people are looking at us as problems because the only data you collect is about our problems. You do not collect data that relates to us in the concept of well-being, of who we are, of who we want to be. And this has been reported year after year after year. There has been so many commissions take place, so many studies, so many different recommendations over the years that have said, you know what, it's not working, feds, it's not working. Things have got to change. Maybe we got to move to actually strengths-based measurements. Maybe we need to move to actually letting the people determine what it is they want to measure themselves. Maybe the First Nations have identified unique priorities, such as language and culture. Now, understanding language and culture, it is not just a way to communicate with each other. Parlez-vous français? Oh, oui. You know, do you speak English? Oh, good. Our worldview, our culture is embedded in our language. And so language to us is paramount to actually bringing back our identity, our uniqueness, our distinct identity as unique nation groups. And you know what? Canada has now adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and they've created law to endorse those articles. So the federal government has UN DRIP-A, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The province of British Columbia has got the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So both levels of government for us in BC have acknowledged the articles, but they're acknowledging that Indigenous people have these rights. And so they're the ones who are determining what those rights mean. How can they do that? How can they determine what the impact of their processes were on us? They're still like looking in from the outside, looking out from the inside. That's it's like, which direction? Who's looking at whom here? We want to look at ourselves. The we is not Indigenous people. The we is not First Nations people. The we is the Ktunaxa people, the Intlakapan people, the Kwakwaka'wakw people, the Sioux people, the Tsiotkotin people. Every one of the unique nation groups across Canada wants to look at themselves and measure themselves. We want to take our ownership of our own data back. And so understanding that this forced assimilation, it's got to stop. It's got to stop. Declaration says it's got to stop. and that any action, aim, or effect of depriving us of our distinct identity has got to stop. So we can no longer use the assimilative term First Nations to accommodate the 82 unique nation groups of Canada, the 34 unique nation groups of British Columbia, 200 Indian bands attached to 34 linguistically unique nation groups. And for the Ktunaxa, knowing that we are unique, we are an isolate ourselves in the Haida in British Columbia, unique languages. While the Haida over there on an island makes sense, us down here in the Kootenays, we might as well be in the island with the great big mountains that sort of separate us from the rest of the province and in Alberta. So understanding who we are and our uniqueness, that's what data sovereignty is. It's about us taking back our rights. And so this declaration on the rights of Indigenous people, it's got to now become the declaration on the rights of the Ktunaxa peoples, the declaration on the rights of the Ntlakapan peoples, the declaration on the rights of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, the declarations on the rights of the Inuit people. So whoever we are, we distinctly need to put ourselves into this declaration to take back our rights. So we can self-determine. We can, as each nation group, determine what it is we want from the future. Our identity is core and central to our well-being. And again, for the Ktunaxa, knowing that our territory is a vast territory, and we're not only located in Canada, we're located in Idaho and Montana as well. And so our completeness of our territory, recognizing that the sovereignty of our people is for the completeness of our people, and the data sovereignty and intellectual property ownership extends over the whole of our people, because our language belongs to all Ktunaxa, north and south of that 49th parallel. We know our territory because our language attaches us to that territory. We have words in our language to describe the places, the events that occurred across the whole of our territory. When we go into somebody else's territory, we run out of words. We start using their words to describe those areas. And we know each other, neighbor to neighbor. The Syilx know us, the Secwepemc know us, the Blackfoot know us, because they're our neighbors, and we know them as well. So our data sovereignty is about taking ownership of our intellectual property and our identity back. It doesn't really cost us a lot. When we get into data governance, that's where it starts to actually, be practical. We have to actually exercise those rights. We have to actually not just say we got the right, but move that right into action. Then we got to look at data records and information management as well as archives. As governments, those are assets of our governments. And for the Ktunaxa and all Indigenous populations, understanding that those rights that are contained in DRIPA are not individual rights. They are collective rights. Indigenous rights are collective rights. Human rights are individual rights. Yes, we have human rights. We are humans, but I am Ktunaxa, hun ene Ktunaxa. And that means I have rights as a Ktunaxa person as well. But no one can tell me what those rights are except the Ktunaxa. And those Ktunaxa will also tell me how I behave when I'm exercising that right. And that is our responsibility, to continue to have the privilege that that right affords us. And so rebuilding our governance, rebuilding our structures, our systems, and having the data to actually know that this is happening. That's what we're talking about. And asserting intellectual property ownership in the collective so that we actually are doing this in the right way, in a good way, not as individuals, because that's what the newcomers taught us about this, capitalistic, every person out for themselves. That's not how we are. Dr. Ktunaxa. It's about us collectively being well. And everything we do is to make sure that the next generation is going to be better off than we were. And so philosophies like the best place to store your extra meat is in the belly of your neighbor. There's not enough Ktunaxa to throw even one away. Those represent our values. And the things we value, we need to protect. And it's no different than data. We have to determine what it is that we value so we can assign value to that data, so we know how to protect that data, how to let others use that data potentially or not. And so our vision of strong, healthy citizens and communities, etc., we have to be able to put that in definable terms. We have to be able to measure that. And we have to know that it's in our systems. It's down in our systems where we manage resources, we manage programs and services, that's basically where the data is coming from. But it's how we create standards for the ownership and control of that data. And you'll see OCAP here. Ownership and control is governance. Access and possession is management and services. So you generate the data through your services, you manage those processes, and it needs to inform your governance. Because again, when we think about what we're trying to achieve here, is governance and creation of standards so that you are creating good institutions, healthy institutions, to then drive towards people becoming healthier. Because governments don't create healthy people. People create healthy people. Governments create the right environments, change circumstances so that people's behaviors will change. And over time, we become healthier. Healthier environment, healthier people. That's both physical and social environments, of course. And we need the data to determine whether or not that's happening. So the Ktunaxa worldview, the Ktunaxa practice standards, the way we do our business, we have to define all of that. Then we can look at the data we need to actually substantiate that. Again, understanding we need quantitative data, those things that we're going to measure over time, that scientific measurement kind of thing. And the qualitative data, how are you feeling about all of that? So looking at our data world in its wholeness, and then understanding we've got to be able to measure certain things in a daily basis, certain things in a more or less frequent way, and certain things are going to be measured over time, because you don't change things like moving from a dependent society to being independent overnight. That's a long journey. We didn't become dependent peoples overnight. It's been 100, 200 years of colonization that's caused us to be that. So we got to know this is a journey back towards becoming self-sufficient and independent. And it's self-determining the processes to get us there. That's the approach that we're taking. So if we apply the concept of thinking of data and jurisdiction and services and practices and standards inside of the construct of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, but then the other legal framework of Canada, and understanding that the Constitution Act actually recognizes, Section 35 recognizes our rights, and that DRIPA is keying off of that. So the rights holders in Section 35 are the DRIPA rights holders, and then the peoples, to be determined by us of who we are the ones who actually implement those rights over time. So data sovereignty connects to DRIPA. It's about us recognizing who we are. And so for purposes of application, I've chosen C-92, which is the federal child welfare legislation for Indigenous peoples. It was just passed recently, a year or so ago, a couple of years ago now. Gosh, here we are, 2022. So the C-92 legislation is recognition legislation. It's federal law that recognizes that Indigenous people have the right to care for our children in ways that we want to care for them as governments. And so this law, this jurisdiction that's this law is recognizing our jurisdiction. And then we as governments have got to now figure out what we're going to do with that law. So we've got to create services, we've got to create structures, programs, all of those things, and have the data to be able to tell us whether or not we're doing that work in a good way. So again, thinking about the data sovereignty component and DRIPA, the right to redress. So our governments can now start to negotiate with the other governments for the resources to do the work we need to do to apply, to take that ownership now into the domain of control. Because when you start to control something, it means you've got some capacity to do it, right? You've got to have the ability to control. You can stand up and say, that's my data, and that's fine, but what you're going to do about it? So governance is continuous quality improvement. That's improved relationships, improved environments, improved services, and hopefully improved outcomes because of what you do. And so building the internal capacity, that's knowledge, tools, and instruments. For example, having the understanding of what data you're going to need in your child welfare environment, knowing what you need, having the tools to get that data. Do you have an electronic data system? Do you have the right input forms, the right forms doing these things, and the instruments, the data sharing agreements, the informed consent documents, et cetera, et cetera? Do you have all your policies in place? So understanding what that is for us. And then really driving down to data's records and information management, including, of course, archives. That's the regulating access and possession piece. So if you think about OCAP, we've got ownership and sovereignty, control and governance, and access and possession regulation and performing that in a management. So one to the next, they cascade. A lot of times we start down here without doing that, or in a recognition component, or having good governance in place. And that's where we get into trouble. And so we need good data, quality data, of course, for planning, for managing, for evaluating, for reporting, so that we can do that continuous quality improvement. But we have no access right now as First Nations governments. We have very little capacity coming to us to do this work. We're not recognized as governments and not funded as governments unless we negotiate that to one of their channels. As I say, the negotiations environment has changed now that the DRIP is in place, And so we as the nation governments have to stand ourselves up, first with a declaration of data sovereignty. And for the Ktunaxa in Canada, it would be recognizing that we are the Ktunaxa peoples. Through this particular declaration of data sovereignty, we're saying we own our language, we own our identity, we own our data, and these are the governing bodies at this current time that are holding the rights on our behalf. Yakit, Aknukliit, Akisknuk, Yakanuki, and governments. So those four governments, the governments of the Ktunaxa Nation, not the Ktunaxa Nation government, but the governments of the Ktunaxa Nation, collectively working together to assert ownership and control of our data. Interesting, this open data agenda I've been involved in, as I say, from about 2014-15. And that was at that point where we were hardly even mentioned in the open government plan. Initially, it was to make sure that the First Nations people were benefiting from our tax benefits, because a lot of people don't file tax returns and all of this company, so you don't get your baby bonus and whatnot. So that was kind of positioned in that way to make sure people are getting what their benefits, what their rights are as far as benefit goes. No mention of Indigenous sovereignty or any of those kind of concepts at all. I pushed quite hard on Treasury Board back in 2015 and pushed to the point where we got included as Indigenous people, the First Nations people, in a panel in the International Open Data Summit that was being held in Ottawa. And so I gathered together some colleagues of mine, some very powerful speaking Indigenous First Nations women from the United States, and representing and working with tribes and nation groups across the globe, really, some people in Australia and some people in New Zealand. And we actually had a very well-received panel, and it became a highlight of the event. And since that time, we've been participating quite, I'll say hit and miss in some instances, but regularly with the Treasury Board team in relation to the evolution of open government. And so in 2016-18, we saw a little bit of an expanded interest when they saw a conversation around disappointed that the draft plan did not actually understand the important role Indigenous communities should play in open government. Because initially there was a talk about vulnerable populations needing to be included and represented. And then it got a little bit more pointed and called us Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. In 1820 government plan, it actually got a little bit better and talked about nation-to-nation relationships based on recognition of rights, respect, etc. However, we're still not there because they don't know who the nations are and they don't know who our governments are. So they can't actually move into this nation-to-nation relationship until we say who we are. This new plan that you may have seen come out, it's September published, I believe. Well, it's getting a little bit better, even though we haven't improved so much on the ground, at least in philosophy and understanding of why we haven't got any better. I think it's starting to sink in a little bit. And so again, some lessons learned from the last iteration. While we made every effort, blah, 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 we fell a little short, blah, 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 and that we need to think about a more dedicated approach. So 3 of 5 themes, they say, involve commitments. Commitments involving working with Indigenous peoples and communities. Indigenous peoples and communities. Okay, solve this gap. Solve this gap. So here we go about gap closing again. And I tell people all the time, be careful about gap closing, because you can close a gap in 2 ways. You can, yes, achieve a higher standard and a gap closes, or mainstream can get worse and the gap closes. So instead of closing a gap, let's actually define what it is we want and let's measure towards that. So what they say they're going to do in the Canadian plan this year, in Canada's plan, by 2024, with the lead department, Indigenous Services, is that they will, working in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, internal and external stakeholders, create a data sharing policy that would facilitate data sharing with Indigenous governments. Indigenous governments. I've finally seen those words written, and organizations and their partners. So we're still, we got understanding where we got the peoples in there, et cetera. But now we're not just communities, we're recognizing our governments in our communities. And that while addressing key data governance issues, such as protecting confidentiality of community level information, right? So they've got to, yes, protect privacy, it's very important, but we've also got to go into this place of government to government relationships. So we're finally being called governments, but we're still not identified yet. So that's what's going to happen as we do this work in this First Nations data strategy. So as we've been pushing Treasury Board for recognition on this open data, on this open government plan, et cetera, we've also been at the same time pushing for recognition to get some resources to put our own strategy in place, our own data plans in place as First Nations governments distinctly, not so much as the broader Indigenous population, which includes Métis and Inuit peoples, but the 82 unique groups that make up that broader category of First Nations. So moving so we can actually be distinctly recognized. So in each region across Canada, province and territory, there's action underway because of resources we acquired from Budget 2021, which are just rolling out now in 2022, latter part of the year here, which is, what federal governments usually are on timing. And so those resources will be coming into regional organizations across the infrastructure of the First Nations Information Governance Center. So that national data center that First Nations created years ago in 2010. That agency, I'm a volunteer director for BC. We will be working with the nation groups in each province and territory to identify their governing bodies, have a delegation of authority from them to actually develop the BC Data Center. And so over the course of the next few years, we'll be securing the governance authority and the standards for the center to operate on, and for collective data governance to occur in, and for some standards for the other governments to aspire to, for things like open data engagement. So we'll be defining an engagement and decision-making pathway that gets right to those title-holding governments in BC that have the rights to do this work on behalf of their people. And so our landscape has changed. Things have evolved a little bit. We still aren't quite there, but we see conversations moving in the right direction. The will is there now, so we just have to find the way forward. And so in these forums and holding people accountable for these conversations we have, and ensuring that we're working on data quality at the same time as we're working on the openness of the data. Because it's fine to open the data, but is that the data we want? And so recognizing, you may know that I have worked with the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner on their work in disaggregated data. And I gave them a bit of insight, and their report became called The Grandmother Perspective. And that's really a perspective I gave them about why do we have that data to begin with? And so as a First Nations person, I felt like Indian Affairs has been Big Brother. You remember Big Brother, George Orwell, data, you remember all of that? That's kind of how it's been. And so I was saying we need grandmother in that seat. We need grandmother to be, the philosophy of government to be like grandmothers. We need to know because we care. And we're only going to use what you've given us for that. And we're going to be good at keeping your secrets. And we love you. So we want to make sure that you're involved in this. And so making sure that it's not just applying that philosophy to First Nations or Indigenous peoples. That philosophy is for all peoples who have distinct identities. And some, of course, might be female, women, some might be LGBTQ, plus, whatever. We might have all different identities. But whenever a government is looking at disaggregation of data to report out on a distinct population, that population has a right to be involved in the creation of the standards, the governance for that data. So the ownership, recognizing that it's not your data, federal or provincial government, that comes from your citizens. It's their personal data that you turn into population data, but you still need to protect it and treat it as if you were the grandmother and that was your grandchild. So be careful, because data, as I've heard, is the new oil. And we remember plastics made of oil and how that is affecting us now as a society. So let's take care as we move forward in this open data agenda. Let's make sure we're recognizing each other, the rights we have, but also just recognizing ourselves as humans and making sure that we're doing this in a good and kind way for the betterment of all of us. So thank you for including me in your program today. Sorry I couldn't be with you in person, and good luck for your event. Thank you.